Hi everyone, it's Ellis here, the producer of the True Story London podcast. I just wanted to let you know that today's episode is the season finale of our first season of True Story London. And we want to say a huge thank you to everyone who's listened, and particularly those of you who have subscribed so far. The next season will be along before you know it, but first, let's listen to this episode with the fantastic guest storyteller, Bonnie Oddie.
Welcome to the True Story London podcast. I'm Michelle Toth. In this podcast, we listen to a true personal story told live at one of our shows in London, followed by a conversation with the storyteller about their background, process, story themes, and more. Today's storyteller is Bonnie Oddie, sharing the story of her mother, newly diagnosed with dementia, asking for Bonnie's help going to Dignitas for assisted suicide. It's a profound story about life and suffering and choice and family dynamics that Bonnie somehow manages to make as funny as it is serious. In our conversation after the story, Bonnie shares the insight and wisdom she got from this incredible experience. But first, let's listen to her story, recorded live at 21 Soho.
I moved into my mother's house with my two teenage daughters against every instinct in my entire body. It was right. However, it did give me the unique opportunity to become both a bad mother and a bad daughter at the same time. This story is how that time of 3 generations of thoroughly pissed off women living together under the same roof came to quite a dramatic end. Okay, so at the end of a week in Corfu with my younger daughter, I felt what I can only describe as a disturbance in the force. My older sister and my mum, whether it's the silence that's a fraction too long or the shape of a text message, I know when something's up. So I called my mum. And she said, "There's been an argument. I'm never talking to your sister again." I was like, "Okay, I've heard this one before." Okay. So I called my sister and she says, "Bon, there's been a really mental argument. It ended on quite a heavy note. Mum doesn't want me to tell you this and I don't want to ruin your holiday." But I'm like, "Just tell me, what is the thing?" And she says, "Okay, well, we had a massive argument and Mum ended it by telling me that she's been diagnosed with Alzheimer's and she wants to go to Dignitas for an assisted suicide." Okay. I didn't really feel much in that moment. It was more just a sense of bracing myself for a journey ahead. You know, like that scene in Jaws where he puts the harness on and he clips himself to the boat? My mother is Jean Hart, born in 1931 in the East End of London as Jean Budgeon. But she was married 3 times in her life, and Malcolm Hart was her first husband, and he had the best name, so she kept it. Jean Hart was a singer, actor, researcher, teacher, artist, political activist, historian. She could sing a song in almost any language. She could cook, crochet, knit, sew. She was an amazing gardener. She knew about fashion, architecture, politics, and how to fix a sash window. She built the NHS, fought apartheid, and defended miners, printers, teachers, and women's bodies. She knew the world and its stories. She knew the name of everything. She was a counsellor, a socialist, a dictator, a weed-smoking, wine-drinking, furiously cheekboned, bright blue-eyed, incredibly healthy, beautiful, fiercely protective, yet strangely neglectful mother with a keen sense of style, a deeply sharp, sometimes cutting, sometimes clownish sense of humour. Evacuated in the war, she was clever. Abandoned by her parents, she was taken under the wings of her teachers. She went to grammar school and ended up at Oxford University. She was a brilliant and dutiful grandparent to my girls. As kids, they were enjoying weekly sleepovers at Nana's house, eating bespoke dinners, and talking Greek mythology with Nana deep into the night. Jean Hart did not fuck about. She craved and created love all around her, while denying its very existence. Literally, I don't believe in love. Proving I love Jean Hart was like trying to keep autumn leaves from falling to the floor. I would fail beautifully. It was a few months before my mum decided to tell me anything, but she still wouldn't let me tell the girls because Jean Hart did not do vulnerable. At first, Mum was convinced that she could sort it all out with the neighbour Don. However, the day my sister found Jean Hart marching down Kentish Town High Street to the local GP with half-filled-out Dignitas forms in one hand and a note in the other saying, "Give me my medical records, I'm going to kill myself," it was pretty clear that Don and Jean had not grasped the subtleties of illegal visits to Dignitas. And therefore, Jean Hart eventually turned to me and my sister and asked us to help her organise her death. And we did. The end. No, not really. The phrase is, "I've wasted time, now time wastes me, and I've left over life to kill, I just want to die," were regulars, but they had been for years. Dignitas can't help you die if you're just fed up with life. But when you're Jean Hart, facing a debilitating disease, grief, her husband had died, and old age, and living with your daughter and 2 teenagers, you are fed up with life. I had to question what I was helping her to do. To help her end her life in the face of a disease that no one could do anything about was one thing. To help her end her life because she'd lost hope or no one loved her enough was another. I really needed her to help me clarify this difference by telling me that she was happy and that she did feel loved and everything was fine. But she couldn't, or she wouldn't. I had to find my own clarity. Mum said again and again, "This country is cruel. If I could just do it at home, I would. If there was a pill I could buy that I knew that would work, I'd just do that." Eventually, I had to tell the girls about the dementia. There was a new kind of heaviness in the house. And my fear was that if they didn't know what was up, they would think it was them. But I still couldn't tell them about Dignitas. It is illegal in the UK. And they would have had to have kept it a secret. And that was too much to ask 2 teenage girls with already very complicated lives. You also have to be in your right mind to go to Dignitas, but I do wonder what we mean when we say right mind. So in cases of dementia, it basically means that you can't wait until the disease is too developed before you go, or else it's too late. So you have to go before the symptoms become obvious. So the clock was ticking day by day. And waking up each morning and remembering, how do I tell the girls? When do I tell the girls? Was hell. And Jean Hart was quite clear that that was my problem. She had enough on her plate. One suggestion that she did offer was that we took her to Zurich for a weekend away, and she fell over and died while we were there. But that was never going to work because Jean Hart would never go to Zurich for a weekend away. Paris, yes, but Zurich, no. And there's no Dignitas in Paris. Dignitas also needs you to have a psychological assessment confirming that you are in your right mind and all your medical records. And bearing in mind that it is illegal, acquiring these things isn't straightforward, but my sister and I did our best. There are people in the UK who support this process. It's all very cloak and dagger, Jean Hart would say. But eventually we got everything we needed. My sister also found some research that suggested that the people who process assisted suicide of a loved one the best over a long period of time are the people who actually attend. So that was interesting. Eventually, in December 2018, we booked a date. It was going to be the 13th of March 2019. So we had a fucking weird few months ahead. The time came when I had to tell the girls. As my mum had often requested, throw me off a cliff if I ever lose my marbles, I think they kind of knew what was coming. However, it was messy. I definitely got it wrong. But I told them separately and without mum at first. And then we came together. There was tears and hugs and a kind of surrender. It was about 2 weeks before the date, and we gave them the option of coming, and of course, without hesitation, they said, "We're coming." So that was that. My sister, her husband, her 21-year-old, my two daughters, aged 16 and 17 at the time, Jean Hart and I packed our strange bags and got on a plane to Zurich. The rest is a blur. There's moments. There's wondering if it's appropriate that I want to go around duty-free. There's our phones ringing as the letters that Mum decided to send just before we left started to arrive on her friends' doorsteps. Hi! Yeah, we're just at the airport. That's weird. There's cheese fondue. There's a lake. There's a mountain. There's singing songs in a hotel room, and there's jokes. So the night before my mum died, I found myself Googling quick jokes. And as we were waiting for the cabs to arrive to take us to the final destination, Jean Hart comes to me and grabs me by both hands, looks at me with her blue eyes and goes, "I'm having a wobble. Can you help?" And I said, "What's the best thing about Switzerland?" And she said, "I don't know." And I said, "Well, I don't know, but the flag's a big plus." There's more. And she was like, I don't know if I'm amused by this. And I was like, "Mum, what did the Buddhists say to the hot dog vendor?" And she was like, "I don't know." And I said, "Make me one with everything." And this time she laughed, and that was us all the way to Dignitas. So we arrive, and the place is like a mini IKEA-type building. It's weird, with a garden at the front and 2 plastic flamingos. You walk through the door and into like a bedsit situation. There was a woman with grey hair and a nice earring called Erica, and a man whose name I only remember as Unshk. Although I think I might have misheard that. Anyway, there's a bit of paperwork, and Jean Hart is offered the final 40 minutes with her family, which she declines. Rude. The process involves taking 2 shots, like tequila. The first shot prepares the body and stops it from rejecting the second shot, and you have to wait half an hour in between them. So she downs the first shot, and the next half hour is trying to work out the next half hour. Joni Mitchell? No. God, please. Thank you. I don't know. Sometimes are meant to be so meaningful that they kind of lose all meaning and they remain a bit unfulfilled no matter what you do. Jean Hart chose to sit on the sofa and not lie on the bed because Jean Hart does not do vulnerable. She was flanked by her courageous grandchildren who blew my mind that day. I think the last thing she said to me was, "Sorry things have been so difficult." And I said, "Sorry I've been an arsehole." And she said, "I'll be the judge of that." I want to say it's okay. In fact, it's quite healthy to want to end suffering. One morning, weeks earlier, after we had made the date, things had been fractious between Jean Hart and I. Let's say I had stopped even trying to keep those autumn leaves from just dropping to the floor. So I was boiling the kettle, and she came to me in the kitchen. She leant on the counter in front of me and she said, "You're happy about this, aren't you?" I thought it was a rhetorical question, so I smiled. She was like, "Look, you're smiling." I smiled like I did when I was accused of doing something naughty as a kid. People always thought I was smiling because I was guilty, which I definitely was guilty, but probably not of the thing I was actually being accused of. I was looking forward to this. I was looking forward to an end of the suffering. Hers, mine, my sisters, my girls. I wanted to get to the other side of it, and I didn't feel guilty about that. I felt awkward. Because we're not supposed to embrace death. We're not supposed to accept loss. We're supposed to rage against the dying light of the thing, "Oh, well, I didn't." And I don't. After she died, she was still sitting on the sofa. And this choice of position made sense when she was alive, because lying down to die when you don't even really feel sick would be weird. But The moment she became dead, sitting up on the sofa with her grandchildren sitting either side of her, kind of slumped, it was more weird. So, a note for anyone thinking of dying in the company of others: choose your position wisely. It's not something you can alter after a certain point. I say go for horizontal. It kind of lends itself to gravity, a kind of sense of peaceful rest. And I'm calling that my death hack. That's for free. So as we milled about the room, I heard her voice and it said, "This is vulgar, please leave." And so we did. When I tell people that we took Mum to Dignitas, the usual response is, "That's so brave." Apart from the time I told someone at a party, they thought I said Disneyland. That was just a bit of a confusing conversation. But usually it's the brave thing. My experience is, like most things, it's more complicated than just brave. You introduce the truth of choice to the inevitability of death. You add Gene Hart, old age, sickness, and some family dynamics, and all of a sudden ideas about suffering and courage and bravery and cowardice are no longer straightforward. I am a practicing Buddhist. I believe that the bonds that we create in life with people are eternal. And I believe that Gene Hart and I will definitely cross paths again. I hope I have courage. I hope I have compassion. And I hope I never have to take her to Disneyland. Thank you very much.
Bonnie, welcome to the podcast.
Hello.
How does it feel hearing that story again after so many months?
There's too many pauses. I'm like, hurry up. Just hurry up. It's not that, I'm going to say it's not that interesting. I think maybe it is. I don't know. It's hard.
Do you recognize how interested everyone who has ever heard that story in every workshop, and certainly when you told it, they've just been wrapped. Like, I would say it is one of the most interesting stories we've ever heard.
When I listen back to that story, I'm reminded of the actual events. And like my life and my family's life at that time was so incredibly complicated. So when I first thought about telling that story, the context, because there are so many other stories in it. I mean, the stuff that my daughters, Gracie and Ella, were dealing with at the time, regardless of this, and just the dynamic, like even the story of living in my mum's house, even without this, is massive and was a really intense time. So there were so many other stories, basically, without even going into it. All of that context felt like I can't tell this story until I've explained how intense life was anyway. And then it sort of dawned on me like, but that's not this story. And with true stories, you've got a finite amount of time, and it's like, no, Bon, that's a novel. Like,
that's your memoir.
That's like a 2-hour one-woman show, and I don't want to go and see that show, so I don't know why.
I do.
I don't know. But, when I originally wrote it, there was kind of a caveat at the beginning that said there are 3,000 other stories that are this story, and they are all true. It's funny, I had this thought the other day, because I've started writing more stories since doing this. Is there such a thing as a true story? I got to a point where I was like, there's no true stories and all stories are true, because it's just about perception and experience and what you've decided. And the minute you tell a story, it becomes true. And my mum was a brilliant storyteller and she was a brilliant exaggerator. So I was trying to write stories from my childhood, and then I realized I don't know if these are true. Or they're just stories that like my mum was really good at sort of making, she'd take an idea and really run with it, So it was like, actually, I don't have any memory of that. And yet I've been telling it as though it happened all my life. So
your brain willed it.
Yeah, and it just took me into like, is there any such thing as a true story? So it's a true story within 3,000 other possible stories of a time told in a way that I guess I hoped a true story audience might enjoy. I was also aware I needed to tell my version and not try and tell anything about my sister's version or anything about my daughter's version, because we all experience that in very different ways. If we were all asked to tell that story, there'd be very different stories.
Lots of different perspectives, nuance.
Yeah, absolutely.
Noticing different details, making different meaning of the same event.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
It's hard to take in all the dualities that Jean Hart, that you shared in just in your story. And then I know she had this huge life. I mean, you did a brilliant job of encapsulating her for us and giving us a sense of her. But in terms of the things you had to leave out, what are the things that would be top of mind for you to say about her that you think are interesting to know?
I think like that thing of like sometimes cutting, sometimes clownish sense of humour. I went to see my friend the other night, really old friend of mine that I went to school with, and we were talking about mum, like Jean Hart came up in the conversation, and she said, "Oh my God, your mum, she just in passing like introduced her boyfriend to my mum, and they had a brilliant chat, and then she turned to my friend and said, he's wasted on you." And that is the kind of thing my mum would say. And my friend was like, it really, like, it's still in my head. I'm still like, she's true, it's right. But at the same time, she would champion you. So it's like she would build you up with one hand and like tear you down with another. And it was all done with a kind of humour. So you could never come back at her with it, because it was like, oh, I was joking. But she was just really sharp, like ridiculously sharp, and just real. And she was funny. She taught clowning. She was a drama teacher for years.
Really?
Yeah, Rose Bruford, and she used to teach clowning. She went and she studied in Commedia. Her go-to joke was to put something on her head and be really serious. So we've got both my sister and I have got in our phones like hundreds of pictures of Jean Hart just kind of looking at the camera, really stony face, but with something ridiculous on her head. It was like her
like
thing.
What? Like
it would like
banana?
it would be like a plant pot. It'd be a hat, but she had a really small head as well. So all hats looked massive, and she knew that there was a comedic thing in it.
And then Bonnie, when you look at what you've inherited from your mother and what you see of Jean Hart in you, is that a short list, a long list?
There's a fierceness. Like I say, she was a very complex person. I think she had like a fundamental lack of self-worth. When things got heavy, there was a lot of self-loathing that was that hadn't really been excavated or kind of transformed in her life. But alongside that, there was also a kind of real resilience and a true value for people and life. And I think like that she expressed that very much through her politics. So I think those two things combined, I can't quite articulate it, but there's a kind of robustness about life that I think I've kind of got a bit from her. And I think, she brought me and my sister up to think. She was always incredibly creative, and she'd read books and kind of ask questions along the way. And, she'd look at pictures and point out unusual things. And, she really kind of taught us to see the world creatively. Like, she was ridiculously talented, my mum. She was a beautiful singer. She made an album called My Name is Jean Hart and I Sing. She used to work with a guy called Richard Rodney Bennett. The only singing I saw her do during the 80s, when I was growing up, she used to have a band called This Band, and she used to do and she'd say it's This Band as opposed to Dat Band. And she would do all the GLC nuclear bunker parties like Rock Against Racism. And so her creativity had to be attached to a cause. It was never just for the sake of... She would privately draw. She went to St. Martin's School of Art as well. She was she could do everything.
It's hard. Is it hard? It must be difficult to have a mother who is so much larger than life.
I think probably... I think she was a massive character, yeah.
Yeah.
And both her and my dad were very kind of critical people when it came to creativity, because they both were just very talented. So I think me and my sister, both of us have this thing where we can't imagine doing anything other than being creative, like having a proper job or anything. But at the same time, our creativity is kind of very stifled because we've got massive inner critics.
Yeah.
I think we're clever, but we're kind of too clever for our own
good.
Yeah. It's like, well, don't do that. Yeah, that was quite good, but could do better.
The taming of the inner critic is a lifelong pursuit for most people.
Yeah.
And I think that it is the key to confidence. The voice that accompanies your everyday living, if it's highly, highly critical, it's very hard to be one's most confident self in the face of that constant criticism. At least that's what I found in my own life and in some of my work with people.
I think, in Buddhism, we call it fundamental darkness, in that there is just a fundamental inherent sort of negativity in life. And what's tricky about it is that it manifests itself in so many different ways. So just when you think you've recognized it and you're like, oh, it's that voice. Yeah, I have to like take the mic away from that voice and give it to a different voice. And it's like, yeah, but it might not be that voice. It might just be feeling really tired. Or it might be an obsession with, a pair of shoes. Or it might, it's like it will manifest itself in so many different ways.
So you mentioned Buddhism.
Yes.
And in the context of this story, it seems to be a really important part of how you made sense of it all and came to grips with it. Yeah.
Massive. I think like when that period of my life, because I started practicing Nichiren Buddhism in 1994. So
a while ago.
Yeah, quite. I was younger than I am now. And when we moved in with my mum and things went a bit mental in my life, I think was when I really committed to kind of deepening my understanding of that philosophy. And, it's a lived philosophy. So it's not a theory. I think a lot of people enjoy aspects of Buddhist philosophy, which is great. Mm-hmm. But there's something about this practice that is like, it's a lived thing day by day. And so I think it was when I entered into that, when everything kind of fell apart, that's when I dug right in. And there is another story. I mean, there's a Buddhist version of this story, which is about the guidance I received. We recite and chant in the morning and the evening, and it's called Gongyo. So we do it twice a day. And before we went to Dignitas, you can get like guidance, Buddhist guidance, from people who have been practicing a long time, who have quite a deep understanding of the philosophy and have lots of experience of faith. And so I went and I got some guidance, and it was 5 days before my mum was going to die. And this man was incredible, and he was so compassionate. And he sat me down and he said, for the next 5 days, I want you to do your morning and evening Gongyo as normal. But I invite you to do it a third time, as though you were your mother. Her thoughts, her feelings.
Wow.
And I was like, that is ridiculous. Do you know Jean Hart? Jean Hart doing Buddhist prayers. This is mental. Like, you're completely mad. But I was like, okay, I'll give it a go. And it was the most incredible experience, because it was, and I think in a way that's where that informed kind of the description of Jean Hart, because there's something very pure about, praying and kind of spiritual practice. It's like you're in front of a mirror in a way. So sitting down as Jean Hart to do a Buddhist, because she was not into, peace, love and bagpipes, she used to call it in her practice, hilarious. First of all, I was like, well, she'd be a bit cynical, but she'd be really good at it. She'd want her voice to sound like slightly better than everyone else's. It's like, if I'm going to do this, I'm going to do it. And that was, she would dismiss everything. She'd do something beautifully and be like, meh, and sort of chuck it away, So I was like, that's how she'd do Gongyo. But in the process of doing that over the 5 days, I had some really, it's like you connect with something, you just feel something. And I felt something about my mum's life and how my perception of her limitations was kind of irrelevant. It was about what she had done with her life, and it was just limitless. It was incredible. It was like really incredible.
Wow.
And it was no longer about my perception of her or my judgment. It wasn't about my story of her. It was just her life. And I think that's where Googling jokes came from. Like that sort of wisdom of like, I don't know why I'm doing this, but I need, I don't know why I'm doing this, but I'm doing it.
Well, it's such an extreme form of empathy to to really try to embody her in those moments of doing.
It was hard because, and also you realize when you do that, Like if you've got an issue with someone, just try and be them for a minute. And it's really hard because you have to get over all your your
own stuff. Yeah.
The real uncomfortable thing. I don't want to be them. And just be like, okay, well, if they were doing this, how would they do it? It's really like you get massive insight. It's incredible.
So I got the impression from your story and talking with you about your story before and after, like this was hard for you. Even though you did all this preparation, you had guidance, that there were elements of this that were just very difficult. And the scene in the kitchen, boiling the kettle, that was one that really stuck with me. I remember us talking about it and you were like, this is all I can say. I can't say more about the tension of that moment or like how hard it was to articulate that you were looking forward to the end of this suffering.
Yeah. What I'm trying to say more than anything is that there is more than one thing going on at the same time. I think we have a tendency to want to find one story, one narrative. Well, she's doing this because of that, and that makes me feel this, and therefore it's not fair, or therefore it is fair. Or no, she's doing this because she feels that, and I really get it. It's like, no, I really get it. I don't get it. I'm angry. I totally empathize. They're all happening at the same time.
Absolutely. That's like the most perfect description of wisdom, of being able to hold all these competing truths or these truths that might be in tension or they might be from different perspectives.
I think, and I think, again, that's, definitely Buddhist practice, helps with that. And I think at the end of the day, what matters most is compassion. Even if you're angry, it's always going to boil down to how you're able to support someone without judgment, I guess. Or with judgment, and then still,
still with love.
Yeah.
Bonnie, you mentioned that one of the things that Jean Hart said in this process was, this country is cruel.
Yeah.
Describing the UK. She didn't have a choice if she wanted to enter life, but to leave the country to do it. And I was wondering if that's a sentiment that you agree with. Like, do you have a point of view, or have you developed a point of view?
Again, I don't have a binary opinion on it. I think it's complicated. What I saw was a woman who wanted to end her life, and having to do it in that way meant that we could not get support with the process. And I'm not saying, and therefore this should be legal or this, because in many ways I don't know. But what I experienced, which I think was not helpful, was I've got so many examples because of other stuff that was going on where I was having to engage with various family counsellors, for example, and schools, and even like the dementia clinic were offering, because I was living with my mum and she'd been diagnosed with dementia. So there was a memory clinic that would offer you support. And I would go to these sessions, and I had this young woman who was really like sweet and lovely, and was trying to help me and going, well, these are some tactics for when, and I'm sitting there going, you don't know that in like a month's time, she's, I'm currently planning a trip to Zurich, and I can't tell you, because if I tell you, you have to inform the police. And so I'm sitting with family counsellors, and I'm not able to tell them what's actually happening, so where do you put it all? So it can become quite dark, and particularly when there's young people involved then in that process, because I couldn't not tell them. There was no counsellor that they could go and speak to prepare. There was no support network. If you do that in Switzerland, one, you can do it at home, and there's counselling for the family, for everyone involved. There's a support network. We don't, you don't have it. You can't tell anyone, and that I think is cruel. That felt cruel. My mum, again, brilliant storyteller, she would sit down. We'd call them Dignitas Mondays. They were like really good episodes from a quite serious like television drama, where my sister would come over and we would sit with mum, and there was like these little drawers with all the paperwork and everything.
Oh, wow.
We'd pull them out and get them out on the floor and say, right, this needs to be filled out, or they're asking you for a brief life history. And some days it went well, some days it ended in tears and like terror, and it would just bring up so much stuff, and like those days were exhausting. And then checking in with mum, like particularly for my sister, because she is the older sister, and I think she felt incredibly responsible. And I remember feeling quite protective of my sister, because I know she was going to have to process a lot of that. So I kind of wanted my mum to make it very clear that this is her choice. Even if we got on a plane to Zurich and she changed her mind, it's fine. Even if she's sitting on, any point, it's like, Mum, are you sure? Don't feel like you have to follow through now just because, just because we filled out some forms or whatever. One day when Mum was trying to convince us that, this was her choice, she said, I went to Dover. I got on a train to Dover and because I thought I'll throw myself off a cliff. But there's men standing there stopping people. Did you know that? There's men standing, and she does have dementia too. So even though it's not very advanced, there is sort of areas where you go, she's got a really good imagination, she's a really talented storyteller, and she's got dementia, and she's trying to convince us of something. We were like, did she go to Dover? We still don't know to this day. If she did,
if she went to Dover.
Yeah. Me and my sister, we did go to a talk one evening about assisted suicide. Particularly, someone asked a question about dementia. And he described it as you have to go at 5 to midnight. You can't wait till midnight. And me and Kate, it became another of our cat. That's my sister came at another catchphrase. It's like 5 to. Are we at 5 to midnight? Is it 5 to midnight? Because that did mean that the clock was ticking.
And Bonnie, so it's been 4 years.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it also was 4 years with COVID in between.
Yeah, pandemic hit just after, and the thought of Jean Hart with dementia in a pandemic. I was like, she really was quite clever. She was pretty smart.
5 to midnight.
Yeah.
And then how are you and the girls and your sister, how's everyone doing now?
You know what? They're doing really well, actually. And my sister just wrote a book. She just had a book published, which does have, Jean Hart is kind of in there a little bit too, which is great. Yeah. Her book is called This Is Where We Live. Kate Hardy, This Is Where We Live. And it's brilliant.
Great. Oh, fantastic.
She's a brilliant writer.
Well, thank you so much for shaping this story, for sharing it with us. It was such a generous act. I can't really thank you enough for being willing to let us in on Jean Hart and her life and your experience of helping her in this unbelievably big decision. I personally feel has been a real gift, not just in your story, but today. So really, thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
Thanks for listening, everybody. That's it for season 1. Remember to subscribe if you haven't already, and do go back and listen to any previous episodes if you haven't caught those. We'd love it if you could also either rate the podcast or recommend it to a friend, or both. The more people that hear about it, the better. The True Story London podcast is hosted by Michelle Toth and produced by me, Ellis Ballard. Our music is by the brilliant band Sea Noise. Live recordings are provided by Laughing Around and are recorded at 21 Soho. And if you're interested in supporting the podcast, head to our website, truestorylondon.com, where you can also find show notes for all of our podcast episodes. We'll see you again soon for season 2.